What's up, guys? Welcome back to APUSH Nerds. Today we're talking about how imperialism fueled U.S. expansion. I'm Reagan.
This is Samira.
This is Jonathan.
And I'm Jace.
So let's get right into it.
Advancements in transportation and communication affected both internal and external migrations to the U.S. during the Gilded Ages. As many technologies began to improve, such as telephones and radios, it allowed for greater communication, which allowed people to move farther and farther apart without being able to lose connection to certain family and friends. Other innovations helped make places like the West less harsh, and it allowed for more people to live out there in the harsher environments without any issues, such as things like the refrigerated car allowed for more goods to be able to be shipped across to the West, which allowed many, many more Americans to move west as it became less harsh out there and they could still stay connected to their families. On the other hand, the U.S. industrial innovations made U.S. heading in a great industrial revolution, causing many Europeans to come to America to try their luck to strike it rich. They thought about how good the U.S. industrialization was and wanted to continue to try to make it rich over here by moving here. The significance of the frontier and the impact of its closing is that the U.S. had thought of the idea of manifest destiny as it was their destiny by God to continue to conquer these lands as it should be their own land, and it was their God-given right to these lands. And the thing was that they were running out of land west, which was considered their main manifest destiny. So, as the West did that, they began to look for other places to begin to continue conquering, such as the islands like Hawaii, Cuba, and etc. But a lot of Americans also lost the idea of the West was considered of freedom, sufficiency, and individualism. And as people lost that, they thought they weren't able to escape the industrial world as well. And America thought they needed to keep expanding. It also led to more people caring for the environment, as when Teddy Roosevelt came into office, more people had seen the land and discovered more of it, and it made them have a greater feeling and impact to the land, and they started doing things like create national parks.
Seward's Folly. Seward's Folly was a popular term used by Americans after the Civil War. It was made about William Seward and his purchase of Alaska from Russia. It was called Seward's Folly because the land was located so far north and it was considered virtually unusable and uninhabitable, and the term was mainly used by anti-expansionists. Annexation of Hawaii. The U.S. wanted Hawaii to use for business with sugar. This meant that it could be sold in the U.S. duty-free. The Queen of Hawaii did not want this. Since she refused, Sanford B. Dole overthrew her in 1893. Then William McKinley convinced Congress to annex Hawaii in 1893. The annexation was rushed through Congress, and William McKinley approved it. It granted Hawaiian people U.S. citizenship also, and as well, Hawaii would receive full territorial status later. Opposing arguments for imperialism. Arguments against imperialism were anti-imperialists thought they shouldn't be forced to live or follow in a certain way. People also claimed that it was unconstitutional to annex other countries and did not agree with it because of that. Also, many people were against imperialism, said that the U.S. is big enough to sell resources and products on their own. It would also cost including having to expand the new military to protect these new territories that they were trying to take over. And lastly, the new immigrants would take jobs and drive down wages, which a lot of Americans were concerned about.
Context on the Spanish-American War. The war emerged from the Cuban struggle for independence from Spain, beginning in 1895. Spain's harsh methods to stop the rebellion were violently displayed for the American public. American sympathy grew for the Cuban rebels, and this led to a popular demand for the U.S. to become involved in the conflict. It became insistent after the sinking of the American battleship, the USS Maine, in the Havana harbor. Discuss Cuba's colonial unrest during the last half of the 19th century. The war originated with Cuba's struggle from independence, as mentioned earlier. Cuban rebels waged war on property, which led to the destruction of sugar cane and sugar mills. Cubans were forced into reconstruction areas in large cities, and those who remained at large were treated as enemies. Those who resided in the reconstruction areas had little shelter, food, sanitation, or medical care. Many died from hunger and disease. Explain America's motivations behind their sudden interest in Cuba. The conflict hurt U.S. investment on the island and almost ceased U.S. trade with Cuban ports, which were extremely profitable for the U.S. Many became interested in Cuba due to the humanitarian sentiment. Conditions experienced in Cuba were graphically portrayed to the U.S. public using yellow journalism, which was the tendency for newspapers to publish articles with interesting and exaggerated headlines to increase sales. This type of journalism was published by newspapers such as the New York World and the New York Journal. The Platt Amendment was approved in 1903, and it served as a treaty between the U.S. and Cuba. The amendment prevented Cuba from making treaties with other nations and gave the U.S. the right to interfere in Cuba to preserve independence, as well as requiring Cuba to permit the U.S. to have a naval station in the territory. However, rather than allowing Cuba to be sovereign, the U.S. maintained some forms of control and influence to keep the country under their thumb. Overall, Cuba had partial independence, and although it was freed from Spain, it was not free from the clutches of the United States.
The course and the conclusion of the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War was in the late 1890s and was very crucial in the rise of America as a global superpower. Even though the war lasted less than a year, the result of the war changed a lot. The war started because America supported countries controlled by Spain's colonial empire to support their independence movements. The war ended the Spanish colonial empire and expanded America's power, especially in the Pacific. The result of the war was the release of several countries under Spanish rule and becoming independent, like Cuba, and other nations like Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines were given over to the U.S. America's relationship with the Philippines. America didn't expand to the Philippines until after the Gilded Age and Western expansion, and they started their colonial expansion. The Philippines was originally a colony that the U.S. obtained after the Spanish-American War, and later they became an independent nation after World War II. Philippine independence was originally part of the reason that the U.S. fought in the Spanish-American War. The U.S. originally didn't want to free the Philippines, but to colonize the nation, and its military occupied the Philippines, causing mass death and destruction for years after attaining the country. Once the Americans learned what was happening in the Philippines, the U.S. had turned away from imperialization and moved to protection. In conclusion, the close of the frontier in the U.S. led Americans to expand on the idea of manifest destiny, and it also fueled imperialism, expanding the U.S. globally. Manifest destiny led to the acquisition of new states like Alaska and Hawaii. Imperialization also brought the U.S. to Cuba for military and economic gain. Lastly, imperialization brought America into a war with Spain and gave them control of new nations like the Philippines and Cuba. The U.S. also wanted to imperialize and take over and not help them gain independence, but control them. Thank you, and our primary sources were History.com and Britannica.